So I've recently written an essay titled Malignant Individualism, which talks about the conflict or the perpetual conflict between individualism on one side of the spectrum, which purports the idea of putting the individual at the nucleus of how humans should conduct their lives, let's say, and then on the other side of the spectrum, collectivism, which purports for putting a higher societal structure, whatever that structure is, on the basis of how humans should conduct their lives, let's say. And I think the conflict between those two ideas or worldviews is really a consequential one on many different angles of life. So as soon as one takes one position or the other, there are a lot of consequences on their remaining life philosophies, let's say, on other issues. So I think it's really interesting to kind of tap into the complexities of this argument. Now, to kind of lay the fundamental assumptions of the discussion, I think it's important as a first step to acknowledge that both the individual and a higher societal structure are equally important in a sense. And I think a lot of people get lost in this discussion or argument trying to argue for the higher importance of one side or the other. But I think this argument is not really about importance if we actually lay out the assumptions properly. It's actually an argument about emphasis, let's say. And I think the first step to kind of think about this clearly is to acknowledge that both of them are equally important because obviously the individual would not exist without the society or the higher societal structure, and the higher societal structure would not exist without the individual. So there is a kind of recursive importance in a sense. And now I think after we establish the importance, we can move on to discuss the emphasis, which one should be emphasized more. And one reason why mentioning this distinction between importance and emphasis is actually important is because, as Ian Miguel Christ once mentioned, an explanation that will take you halfway is only a liability. And I think if we just laser focus on which one is more important and try to focus on it too much, we would be kind of running in circles trying to argue which one is more important when they're both equally important. So to kind of strike the nail on the coffin, so to speak, when it comes to this distinction between emphasis and importance, a lot of important things in life, let's say, for example, like eating food, is not really emphasized in discussions because it's kind of baked into our nature in a sense. So even though it's really important, in a sense, it's one of the most important things in life, it's baked, as I said, into our nature, so we don't really need to emphasize it. So having laid the fundamental and necessary assumptions of the discussion, we can now move on to discuss which one should actually be emphasized more. Should we emphasize the individual more, or should it be a higher societal structure, given the conditions and the complexities of our minds? And I think the first step to take and acknowledge in this discussion is to think about how it's built into the structure of our perception that we're self-centered in a sense. And a way to argue for this is if you imagine taking any person at any given time in their lives, you would see that their thought process is occupied more than 90% about themselves and their goals and their aspirations. And I think no one could really argue against that in a sense because it's kind of, as I said, built into the structure of our perceptions to put ourselves in the main narrative that we're trying to live, let's say, or trying to actualize in the real world. And I think given that assumption and given the nature of our perception, it's really more important to emphasize a higher societal structure, assuming, as we said, that both of them are equally important. But because of that nature or inclination of our perceptions, let's say, it's really important to emphasize also a higher societal structure to balance those things in a sense and kind of integrate the higher societal structure even more into our perceptions, given that it's very natural for us to integrate ourselves into that perception. And there's something to be said with how the individual is not necessarily always in conflict with a higher societal structure, let's say. Most of the times or most scenarios, the individual thinking about themselves would actually elevate the higher societal structure and vice versa. But there are certain scenarios where there is a conflict of interest, and in that conflict of interest, where the emphasis or the argument of our emphasis is actually important to kind of balance the equation in a sense and put the individual as high as the higher societal structure to think about things more holistically in a sense. And this is a really important assumption to lay out because a lot of people think that the individual would go in opposition with the higher societal structure almost all the time. But I don't think that is true, because we see that a lot of the times elevating, or the individual trying to elevate themselves and being self-interested, would by necessity elevate society. But there are certain situations where that is not actually true. And in those situations is where our discussion is actually really important. Now, an example of the opposition of the individual with a higher societal structure, let's say, is something called the replication crisis in science. And I think it's a really interesting example because the replication crisis, which is, as the name kind of indicates, is a phenomenon in science where scientists kind of forge their results to have some kind of a self-interested service to themselves. And in a sense, forging the results is actually harming a higher societal structure, because it's not telling society the truth or other people the truth, let's say, and that would cause all sorts of harms. So in this scenario, let's say the self-interest colluded with the higher societal structure. And in that scenario, it's really important to remind the individual and make the individual remind themselves that, listen, there is a higher societal structure that I need to put in mind. And I think it's much easier to forget society than it is to forget ourselves. And this is why the emphasis should actually lie in the higher societal structure, even though they're both equally important in a sense. Now, this example might be a little bit of a macro example in a sense, but I think we can extrapolate it and apply it to many different scenarios. Now, one thing I actually wanted to mention is why this phenomenon is actually called the replication crisis. And the reason why it's called that is because if the scientist is to kind of repeat their experiment, let's say, they wouldn't replicate the same results in the first experiment because they forged their results in the first experiment. So I think this example really portrays how the emphasis of a higher societal structure is even more important than emphasizing the individual, obviously assuming that they're both equally important. Now, another reason why emphasizing a higher societal structure is important is something that is relevant to the age we live in today, because I think a lot of implicit and explicit philosophies and worldviews purport this idea of being overly self-centered in a sense. It's all about me. And I think, given, as we said, the nature of our psychology, and also trying to emphasize it through the culture, let's say, would lead to almost like an overemphasis of the self. And I think balancing that out with a higher societal structure is really important to be ready for the scenarios in which there is a possible conflict of interest between the individual and a higher societal structure. Now, this leads me to the end of this video, which is almost like a summary of my essay titled Malignant Individualism. And I really enjoyed writing that essay, and I said it would be interesting to kind of explore it in this medium, let's say. And if you would like to expand upon the ideas we've discussed in this video, please consider reading the essay, which I'll leave in the description. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.